Hello, welcome to this new episode of a series of a webinar on migration issue in Southeast Asia. It's a collaboration of Junction, a public venue in Bangkok, with the Institute for Population and Social Research of Mahidol University. And it's part of the Wednesday seminar series that the Institute also always carry on also with different topics. So we are very happy to be able to collaborate with OM on this occasion. OM is really the leading, I think, from my point of view, is the leading migration advocacy group in Singapore. And they have been very courageous in signaling some of the exploitation issue that unfortunately affect migrants, as well as providing services to migrants. Today, we are going to listen about a topic which is not very well known. I think also for people outside of Singapore, I think we don't hear much about this, but it's about retaliation of employers toward domestic worker. And the one talking is the author, I think, of the main author of the report, Jaya Anil Kumar. She's the senior manager for advocacy research at home, and she will be discussing the report she has done, as well expanding on other issues related to this issue of retaliation. And I am also curious to hear if she knows anything about similar cases in other parts of the region. Please.
Thank you so much, Rosalia. I hope everyone can hear me all right. If I am not clear, just feel free to just stop me and I will repeat what it is that I have just said. So good evening. I know people are streaming in from maybe all over the world or the region, but it's 4 p.m. here in Bangkok. So good evening, everyone. My name is Jaya. I work for Home, which as Rosalia mentioned, is an organization in Singapore that assists low-wage migrant workers. And a key demographic of people that we assist are migrant domestic workers. So what I will be speaking on today is basically about employer behaviors and attitudes towards migrant domestic workers, particularly how they use police accusations to retaliate against migrant domestic workers. I think underpinning this entire presentation and the report that we did on this topic is really the inherent power difference that exists between migrant domestic workers and employers, bearing in mind that they have very few labor and social protections in Singapore, as well as the fact that they live in with their employers. It heightens their vulnerability. So I will just begin my presentation now, and I will just share my screen. I will keep it in this mode. I hope everyone can see the main panel here, because in my experience, when I switch it to presentation mode, somehow it just doesn't get shared. So I'll just continue in this way, and I hope that's okay with everyone. So the title of the report on which I am basing my presentation is called "I've Called the Police." Basically, as the title suggests, it's a study of criminal accusations made against migrant domestic workers in Singapore. Now, before I go to the meat of the findings in the report, I think it's important, because I understand we have people here from many jurisdictions, that I give some kind of introduction and context to the living and working conditions of domestic workers in Singapore first. So first and foremost, their entire employability, their entire employment situation is basically tied to their employers. The employers have the right to cancel their work permits and to repatriate them at a moment's notice, right? Although the law does say that employers are supposed to give reasonable notice of repatriation towards the migrant domestic workers, we at Home actually see many instances where they do not get any notice at all or just a few hours notice, and before they know it, they're at the airport. So their employment situation is extremely precarious. And this, of course, makes them very reluctant to report cases of abuse if they're facing any kind of exploitative or abusive living and working conditions. They are reluctant to report it because, you know, they do not have job security, right? So that's one of the first things to remember about their employment situation. In Singapore, the primary labor legislation is called the Employment Act. It gives us protections such as, you know, annual leave, limits on working hours, paid sick leave, and all of that. And domestic workers are excluded under the Employment Act. Now, this is a phenomenon that is actually quite prevalent in a lot of countries. You know, domestic work, because of the value or the lack of value that we place on domestic work and domestic workers, they are often not seen as formal workers and therefore excluded under the primary labor legislations of various countries. And as I mentioned earlier, the third key point that we need to bear in mind is the fact that they are required to live with their employers. So really what goes on behind closed doors is not something that is, you know, easily discoverable. Many domestic workers that come to us for existence, they have suffered in silence for a very long time because the live-in situation, of course, increases the chance of employers to exercise surveillance over their domestic workers, to exercise control, limiting their communications, even limiting the use of mobile phones and limiting their communications with anyone outside the household. And sometimes we hear of explicit cases of domestic workers being told, you know, you cannot talk to anyone outside, you know, if you do that, I'll call the police and so on. Moving to police accusations, when a domestic worker actually is faced with a police accusation in that the employer has called to say, okay, my domestic worker has stolen, you know, from me, or she has done this, she has done that, she has abused my child, whatever the case is, what happens in that sense? They naturally cannot live with their employers anymore because usually it's the employers that would have made the accusation against the domestic worker. So oftentimes they are removed from the employer's house and placed in a shelter. Now, one thing about home is that we run a crisis shelter for migrant domestic workers, and we do get referrals from the police who need to place the domestic worker in a location while the investigations are going on, right? So what happens when they're in our shelter, right? It used to be the case that domestic workers who were undergoing police investigations were not allowed to work. As I will explain a little bit more during the course of my investigations, during the course of my presentation, this has now changed in that domestic workers are allowed the discretion to work even if they're an accused person, all right? So this is a step in the right direction. However, we find that this is still at the discretion of the investigating officer. So basically, they are given permission, so to speak, to work while they are undergoing investigations. Now, this is something that is very key for domestic workers because they are often the sole breadwinners of their families, right? So what they also have to undergo, if they cannot earn for their families and they have to tell their families why is it that they are not sending money, there's a great sense of shame, of embarrassment, you know, because they are unable to provide for their family. They might be seen as a failed migrant, you know, and this, of course, you know, adds to the the psychological kind of stress that they undergo when they're undergoing police investigations. Sometimes employers themselves, even after they have made the accusation against the domestic worker, They do not cancel the work permit of the domestic worker, which means they are still the employer on record. So even if the police has given them the permission to seek employment, they are administratively barred from doing so, because on the record, they are still the employers, right? So this is an added form of retaliation that employers can sometimes use, and we have seen it done in some cases to make it just that much more difficult for the domestic worker to seek employment while the investigations are going on. So this is the objectives of the report. We want to demonstrate how criminal conduct against domestic workers disrupt their lives. I've spoken about it a little bit, and I will speak about it more as I go through the presentation. The power imbalance that I just mentioned, that is a very key factor that underpins all of this, that underpins the entire report. They are, of course, subject to different norms than if, for example, citizens or other people are accused of crime. For example, citizens in a country, even if they are undergoing police investigations, they are still free to seek employment, and it is up to employers to decide whether or not to hire a particular individual. And this is even true after they've been convicted. Right. And the fourth point, which is what I spent some time explaining, there's an arbitrariness to which, permission is given for domestic workers to work. In some cases we see, well, the police officer just says, no, they are not allowed to work. So our report examined 100 cases of domestic workers who were referred to our shelter by the police, and all of them were accused of various crimes. So most of the cases were about theft. Some of it was about child abuse. Some of it was engaging in loan shark activities. Some of it was about undergoing illegal abortions. So we looked at 100 of such cases over a 3-year period, and we analyzed the outcome of each and every single one of those cases. We analyzed the content of the investigations to determine what is the most frequent accusation that is made against domestic workers. And I'm sure all of you can guess what is the most frequent accusation made against domestic workers, and that is, of course, theft. So this is our findings at a glance. On average, and this is of course it varies from case to case, but on average, a domestic worker who is undergoing accusations stays in our shelter for about 4 months. 1 in 5 accusations were made after the domestic worker arrives at our shelter. That's the second point, and I'll just explain this a little bit more. As we are a crisis shelter that provides a safe space for domestic workers, we provide a space where if a domestic worker feels that she can no longer be employed in the employer's household, she can come to us, and we will give her casework assistance, direct services, financial assistance, and so on. We've encountered cases where the police accusation against the domestic worker occurs after they have run away and made certain allegations against their employers, because when they come to our shelter, we have to record down their reasons for running away and submit it to the authorities. So there are 1 in 5 cases, which is about 20 cases. This has happened where the police accusation has happened where the domestic worker has already made certain allegations about well-being issues against the employer. So think about that and let that sit in your mind for a while, and I will explain that in a little bit more detail later, right? Of course, the most common accusation is theft. It makes up 76% of all cases has a theft accusation against the domestic worker. Of these 100 cases, over 80% did not result in a charge, which means to say over 80% of these cases, they did not go to court. They were not given a formal charge. They were basically either the case closed or they were just given a warning. All right. So just let that sit with you as well. Over 4 out of 5 cases, there was basically no tangible outcome. Okay. And only 18% has actually led to a criminal charge. So let me just maybe break down some of these findings. So why theft, right? Like this was the question that we asked ourselves. What is it about the nature of a theft accusation made it so easy for employers to just lobby that against a domestic worker? And what we see in terms of the kinds of accusations relating to theft is that they're extremely easy to make, because the level of evidence, if at all, that is needed to make an accusation against of theft is very low, right? All the employer needs to have is a suspicion, or not even a suspicion, that something is missing, that something is no longer there where it's supposed to be, and they can make that accusation against the domestic worker. And why against the domestic worker? So after we released the report, we sort of had engagement sessions with domestic worker communities to get their responses to the report. And what was overwhelming in their responses is that they said that we are not surprised that theft is the most common accusation, because there is a perception that we are poor. There is a perception that we are untrustworthy. Even though we spend 24 hours with the family, we are still regarded as an outsider. So naturally, the employers then have a tendency to suspect domestic workers when if they feel something is missing, or if it can also be used as a form of punishment against domestic workers, right? If, let's say, they have an argument about something, and we see many accusations be leveled against domestic workers after there has been a dispute. After the dispute, the employer says, actually, you know what, last week I found like $50 was missing from my purse. I am sure you have taken it. And then the police is called, right? So it's a very easy thing for an employer to do, to make such an accusation. Because if you're talking about, for example, abusing another family member, like child abuse, if that's you need some kind. It's a more serious accusation to make for one, but it also requires some level of evidence. Was there a bruise? Was there a mark? Something like So, but for theft, the level of evidence needed is much lower. So, I spoke about the outcomes, and I said that more than 80% there has been no kind of charge that has been given to the domestic worker, and that she has not been brought to court. So I think it's useful for me to sort of break down what are the possible outcomes when you are accused when you have a police accusation against you. So the first one is, the numbering is a bit off. So the first one is no further action, which means the case just closes and, everybody moves on with their life. The domestic worker either moves back home or she finds another employer, right? Number two is a stern warning. All right, let me, I'll pause here and I'll go to the third outcome, which is a conviction. And I think this is pretty straightforward. It means you have charges, you go to court, you stand trial, or you plead guilty and you face the punishment, right? So number one and number three, fairly straightforward. And when I say that over 80% of the cases, it doesn't lead to a charge. So it's the sum of number one and number two, right? So number three is a formal charge, but number one and number two, there is no formal charge. So what is number two, right? Number two is a stern warning. And I'm aware that this is maybe something that is not aware in every country. So maybe I'll just spend a bit of time explaining this. We have the police in Singapore sometimes, instead of charging a person, will give them what is called a stern warning. Now, the stern warning actually says that it does not amount to a conviction for an offense or a finding of guilt by a court of law. In other words, there is no criminal record if you are given a stern warning. It is sort of like an in-between measure between no further action and a conviction. Right? So no resources are spent to bring you to court. No need to engage lawyers. You just go to the police station. They give you the stern warning letter and that's it. Okay. But what we have found is that domestic workers and migrant workers, really, who have received the stern warning, are then disbarred from working in Singapore, in that once they receive if they receive a stern warning from the police, and bear in mind, again, there is no conviction, no charge whatsoever, they find themselves unable to go for re-employment in Singapore, right? Now, compare this, for example, me as a citizen of Singapore, if I've gotten a stern warning for whatever reason, I am able to move on with my life as though nothing has happened, right? But this is used administratively as a tool against the domestic worker being allowed to work again in Singapore. Now, why is this the case? It's because the Ministry of Manpower, which issues the work passes, basically, there is a lot of power in how the work passes are issued, because they can debar any. It's very widely worded. The provision which allows for the work passes to be issued, they may debar, or they can cancel, they can basically, it gives them a lot of power. So in that sense, it's lawful for domestic workers and migrant workers to just be denied work passes. We have seen basically every case of a domestic worker who has received a stern warning being unable to work again in Singapore, right? And this is just a recent case, because recently an activist in Singapore actually challenged a stern warning. And this is what the court had to say. A warning is not binding on its recipient. It has no legal effect. It is nothing more than a communication that if they engage in subsequent criminal conduct, they may be prosecuted instead of being given another stern warning. It is only an opinion. It does not bind the recipient. It is not a pronouncement of guilt or a finding of fact. In other words, it is nothing. It has no legal effect whatsoever. And yet, for domestic workers who receive this stern warning, their lives are uprooted because they cannot stay in Singapore anymore. All right. So okay, let's just move on to outcomes. I think I've spoken about this quite a fair bit. So this is just a visual representation. No further action. Remember, outcome number one is 36%. And 43% are given a stern warning, and only 18% were given an actual charge in which they had to go to court and fight the charges. This is basically a representation, a visual representation of the kinds of accusations that are made. So you can see that very overwhelming, it's theft. And you can see also the percentage of no further action for theft is also pretty significant, right? It's 25% of those that 25 cases rather of those that were accused of theft had no further action, right? So I think that sort of also indicates, the seriousness of the accusation, if for lack of a better term. So, like I said, we have cases of where there's physical abuse, negligence, money laundering, so on and so forth. So out of all these kinds of accusations, we've only had 3 kinds of accusations where there has been a charge actually being like where they had to go to court and basically face these charges. One of which is voluntary causing hurt is basically physical abuse. So sometimes they have accusations of physical abuse against the child or an elderly person who is in the house. Next is for theft, of course, and one case of using an illegal, basically this domestic worker used another person's passport. So only these, in the 100 cases that we have examined, only 3 kinds of accusations led to a formal charge. And in every other type of accusation, so all these other kinds of accusations, basically they either got a stern warning or there was no further action. So as I mentioned earlier, the prevalence of domestic workers who were accused of theft and who didn't get a charge is also quite high. So 80% of those who were accused of theft did not eventually get charged. So I'm now going to come to the consequences, right? I've alluded to all of this before, but maybe I'll just go go into that a little bit more. Loss of time and opportunity to earn income, because whatever stable employment that they had, they will have to give up, when the police accusation is made. So they have to basically, uproot whatever life they know and move to a shelter and wait for the investigations to be over. Loss of residence as well. They have to leave their employer's house. And remember, for the lost opportunity of income, it's a discretionary permission that's given by the police as to whether or not they can work while investigations are ongoing. Administrative hurdles in re-employment. Sometimes employers do not cancel the work permit, police do not give them permission, and of course the stress of facing police investigations and not being able to earn. I think I'll just skip past this because or rather just to give a visual representation again of the length of time that some domestic workers face. So as you can see, there are domestic workers who have spent more than 12 months in our shelter. So that's like a whole year. This is the final part of my presentation where I'm talking about revenge accusations. And I spoke about this earlier, where 20 cases, the accusation was made after they had come to our shelter. And actually the sort of, how should I put it, the inspiration for this research report was actually born out of the case of Pati Liani. You can Google this domestic worker, she's a former domestic worker, to get the full idea of what her case was about. But in a nutshell, she was accused of stealing $50,000 worth of items from her employer's house. At the lower court, she was convicted. She appealed. She went through a trial. She went through an entire trial and she was convicted and she appealed. On appeal, the judge actually found that the reason why they had made these accusations against her was because she had threatened to report her employers for having to work in two houses. Basically, she was being illegally deployed to another house as well, which is prohibited in law, right? Because of this reason and for several other factors relating to her case, she was acquitted. Pati Liani spent 4 years in home shelter, not being able to work, because at that time, accused persons were not allowed to work at all. After her case completed and after, home did some advocacy, she was that rule has since changed, but during Pati Liani's time, there was no way an accused person was allowed to work. So she spent 4 years without earning an income, but she believed in her innocence and we supported her through her journey. And in the end, her name was cleared, right? So let's take a closer look at these revenge accusations. As I said, 20 of these cases, the police accusation was made after the domestic worker had come to our shelter. And 5 of these 20 cases, the domestic worker herself had also made a police accusation against the employer. So in all these other cases, the domestic worker may have complained about some well-being issues, like, there was not enough food, there was overwork and all of that. But in 5 of these cases, they had specifically made a criminal accusation against their employer, and the employer in turn has made a criminal accusation against the domestic worker. And out of these 20 cases, how many of them, so again, theft is the overwhelming accusation that has been made against the domestic worker, 85%, that's 17 of it. And out of these 20 cases that we call revenge accusations, only 3 actually went to court and 17 were not charged at all, right? So again, you sort of it's a similar pattern in which for these kinds of cases as well, the percentage of cases that actually goes to court is quite little. So what does all of this mean? And I'm coming to the end of my to the end of my presentation. it just highlights their vulnerability vis-a-vis the employers and the domestic workers, because employers can throw these accusations out and it severely uproots and disrupts the lives of domestic workers in a very, very serious way, because it rocks their financial stability, their dependents back home are affected, but there is very little impact on the employer. And yeah, they lose their livelihood, incomes, housing, and their work status. And the psychosocial kind of repercussions on domestic workers, these kinds of accusations is also very heavy, because imagining someone who has very little economic stability and you're in a foreign country, the language is foreign to you, the system is foreign to you, and you are basically having to go through a police accusation. It's stressful for anyone, but let alone someone who is not a native of the country as well. So we have a few recommendations. First, we say that the domestic workers, well, if you're involved in an investigation, it's because you're innocent until you're proven guilty, right? So during the course of investigations, you should be allowed to work, and this should not be discretionary. It should be as a matter of right. Those who have been given stern warnings should be allowed to work, because right now, as I said, they are disbarred from working. We should explore live-out options for domestic workers, because we feel that it's that physical proximity, the fact that the domestic worker is in the employer's house, that makes it easier for employers to actually level these accusations against domestic workers, because it's almost like who else can it be other than the domestic worker, that a lot of employers have. So we feel like live-out options will sort of entrench the idea that they're employees, they're someone who comes and does a certain job, a certain task, and then they leave. And of course, we advocate for the right to change employers, because right now domestic workers are not given a free right to change employers. They need the permission of their employers before they can go to another employer. So that's all I have, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive presentation on a phenomena that indeed we still don't know much about, and I think for many will be the first time they hear about, although accusations of theft are of course happening all over the world. I think even when doesn't involve a foreign domestic worker, there is always the tendency of employer to accuse the domestic worker. So I will open the floor. Please, the one here on Zoom, you can raise your hand or otherwise write in the chat, and we can also wait for questions from Facebook, Twitter, etc. So please, who want to start? Oh, here we have. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Shrishti.
And ask the question.
Hi, I'm Shrishti. Am I audible? Yeah, I'm Shrishti from GADW. That's Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women, and we are based out of Bangkok in Thailand. My question was, Jaya, thank you for the presentation. It was fantastic. I wanted to ask if there have been cases where, or how easy or difficult it is for domestic workers to file cases against their employer, if at all, and if you have encountered any. And I'm sure they again come to your shelter, and and how do those cases work? And I'm thinking of a couple of more questions, and I'll come back to those.
Sure. So basically, I think there are two large pockets of the kinds of cases that domestic workers can file against their employers. One is almost a more administrative kind of a system, in that if they are alleging, for example, not enough food or overwork, they basically go to the Ministry of Manpower that oversees the well-being of migrant workers in Singapore, and they file a case there. And they then, the ministry then conducts investigations, and they take action against the employers if there is sufficient evidence. Same thing for police accusations, right? So if, let's say, they're alleging physical abuse or sexual abuse, then they go to the police. Police does the investigation and takes further action. with this group of cases, the problem is often evidence. Because a lot of times the complaint is made not, it's first of all difficult for domestic workers to gather evidence of this. And especially when it comes to like physical abuse or sexual abuse, they're just not able to prove their allegations a lot of the times. And it happens, sometimes they just don't also have the opportunity to make these complaints in a timely manner because they have limited off days, they have limited communication devices and all of that. And the second thing about this group of complaints is that when the labor protections are vague to begin with. For example, a domestic worker, the law says that you have to provide her adequate food. But what is adequate food? She's supposed to get an acceptable accommodation or adequate rest. But, the standards are not clearly defined. So then the threshold for having that the domestic worker has to reach in order for some kind of action to be taken against the employer is extremely high. So we do see cases where employers are taken to court, but I can say that they're very, very few, because it takes a lot of basically evidence before that threshold is crossed. So that's one group of cases. The other group is civil claims, right? Where a domestic worker sues an employer, whether it's for negligence or causing her distress, for whatever case, for whatever reasons. We have been extremely, it's again, because the labor and social protections, if they are vague and they are weak, there is very little basis for a domestic worker to also take their employers to court, because the basis on which she can actually start this claim is very weak. One example that comes to mind is we had two domestic workers who were abused by their it was the same family. They were abused by their employers, and when they went to court, the employers were convicted and they were ordered to give compensation to the domestic workers. But because they couldn't pay, they had no financial means to pay, they chose to simply extend their jail sentence, right? So the domestic workers were still left with no compensation. So there was a lawyer who was exploring whether she could sue in a civil court, right? But on what basis? Because the only thing she could find was a provision in their employment contract that said that the employer has a duty to take care and make sure that the well-being of the domestic worker is looked after. But this is such a weak provision, and it doesn't necessarily, in a court of law, lend itself to damages. So these are the real barriers that a lot of domestic workers face when it comes to seeking remedy or compensation, or basically, to file a successful complaint, because they are very disempowered from doing so. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you for the answer. I think there are some questions from Intan from Bandung, Indonesia. Do you have advocacy to push the issue of job security and also protection of domestic workers to the ASEAN meeting agenda? Because this situation has to involve the states, the states of the domestic workers that are involved, assuming that they care about that. And how far the embassy protects the domestic workers that are in this situation, particularly in this case, the Indonesian embassy, but the question can be also for other embassy. Also about abortion, maybe can you explain more about why abortion is a problem, in this case for domestic worker, how it relates to the legislation for domestic worker of not being able to have children, right, in Singapore. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just take the second question about abortion. First of all, it's illegal for domestic workers to be pregnant in Singapore. It is a violation of the work pass regulations. And so they will usually be repatriated if they're found to be pregnant. In this particular case, I think in the diagram, what that particular domestic worker was accused of was that she actually was pregnant, and the specific charge that was leveled against her was the unlawful disposal of a fetus. Because what she did when she discovered that she was pregnant was to undergo basically, and this is a bit of a trigger warning, she used a device to basically do her own abortion. And naturally, it did not end well. And she was brought to the hospital, and she was actually investigated for the unlawful, it was either the disposal or causing the death of a fetus or something along those lines. In the end, I think she got a warning letter, and she was repatriated, if I recall correctly, this particular case. And on the question about ASEAN, honestly, there is very little G2G cooperation with regards to migrant workers. So, of course, there are many ASEAN meetings about migrant workers where the collective well-being of migrant workers are discussed. But, for example, Singapore as a receiving country, do we have any agreement with Indonesia, Philippines, Myanmar, which are the sending countries of domestic workers? Do we have any agreement with regards to the well-being of migrant workers? We do not. This is something we have recommended, and we have said that, if the migrants they're such a contributor to the economic success of a country like Singapore, and this is true. I think some researchers have even put a dollar value to just how much they have contributed to our economy, and it is in the billions. Then we must have the political power to have G2G agreements about migrant workers, but this has not happened. It's not something that I think is going to happen in the near future as well, if I'm being perfectly honest. And with regards to the embassies, yes, embassies in Singapore do look out for the well-being of their own citizens, but again, I think because they have to maintain their own diplomatic relations. I think the conversations with regards to migrant workers are not aggressive. It is still, I think, the NGOs, but we have good relationships with the embassies in that we do capacity building. Some embassies have a shelter, so they also house domestic workers who are in crisis. And especially during the COVID, there was a lot of cooperation between the embassies and the NGOs. But I think there is, of course, and they recognize the issues because they also see what is happening on the ground, right? They speak to their own citizens, they speak to the migrant workers, but they also have their barriers in really pushing for change with regards to what's happening in Singapore.
Maybe I open again first to see if there are other questions from people. If not, I have two questions. Okay, one is the first, while people still think. So when you choose to support, like the case of the domestic worker who was accused of 50,000 thief, which is quite a major thief, how do you choose? Meaning, if the case was proven that she had done it, would this bring bad reputation to OM, which I understand is often in the crossfire, right? So in which way, because we are dealing with criminal case, although we are assuming that many of these cases are not real, and we have seen from the data you presented. So what are the ethical consideration and other consideration you have as in terms of risk to the organization in taking up some of these cases? Now, the second question, if you can tell more about the legal position of domestic worker, is it considered a job in Singapore? Because this is an issue for the other country like Thailand and Indonesia. At the moment, they are fighting to have recognition of domestic work as work, because they have no social protection and not the rest. So maybe you can tell us more about what is the situation in Singapore.
Okay, with the first question, the simple answer is we do not choose. We assist every domestic worker that comes through our doors. If they are given a charge, and they have to go to court, as was in the case of Parti Liani, we engage a lawyer. We give them resources, whether or not they are in fact guilty, whether or not the court finds them guilty is of absolutely no relevance to us, because as a rights-based organization, we believe that everyone needs resources to legal representation. We believe that, you know, everybody needs to be supported. Everyone should have equal access, basically, to resources that, you know, when it comes to criminal investigations, you know, basic rights such as food, shelter, everything. So you are right to say that this makes us very unpopular with a lot of employers, because they say that, oh, you know, your domestic worker has run away for my domestic worker has run away for no reason. But we say, well, that's your, you know, that's from your standpoint, but she has certain reasons that she came to us, and whether, no matter how seemingly serious or unserious they are, there is absolutely no discrimination for the cases that we take in. Anyone who wants to walk into our shelter has every right to do so. And the second question, sorry, could you repeat the second question?
What is the status, the legal status
yeah,
of the,
yeah.
is it seen as a job or not? Because as you know, in other countries, it's still not considered a job. So they don't have legal protection nor social protection as a job.
As other workers, yeah.
Yeah.
They are considered workers insofar as they have the same kind of legal status as any other person in other sectors. So, for example, a migrant worker from Bangladesh who is in the construction industry, his work permit card will say sector construction. For the domestic worker, it'll just say sector domestic. So in that sense, they are considered workers. Where the difference lies is that, so I will say that, you know, domestic work is considered a job in that sense. It is recognized as a category of workers, right? Of course, where it gets dicey is they are excluded from very key pieces of legislation, which is number one, the Employment Act, and which gives the very basic labor protections. However, there is a secondary piece of legislation called the Employment of Foreign Manpower Act, under which domestic workers are covered. So this does not give the protections that the Employment Act gives, the prime, but it is a secondary, yeah, this secondary piece of legislation is where it says things like domestic workers should have adequate food, adequate accommodation, you know, except an adequate rest and so on and so forth. So there are legislation that covers them, but of course it's definitely does not match up to what the primary labor legislation says. And they are also covered. They are also excluded from the Work Injury Compensation Act, which all other classes of workers are covered under. So if they have a work injury in the employer's house, they cannot claim compensation, which is allowed for other sectors of work. So in a very formalistic way, they are considered workers, yes, to answer your question, but in a substantive way, I think the answer is much, much, much more complicated, because I think, and I'm sure many people in this panel, you are aware, there are so many conversations about perceptions of domestic work, the gender aspect of it, you know, all of that, which comes into why labor and social protections are not given to domestic workers.
Yeah, I mean, there is where alliance among the ASEAN country may be useful, as it seems is something that many are advocating at the moment. Okay, last question, and then I let you free, because I know you have another meeting, very important meeting with UN Women and ILO soon after this. What's happened to those, like the case you had, that she was declared innocent, and after that, was she able to work, or she and others, yeah, so it's not only about the case of the one you mentioned, but in general, are they allowed to work or not, even if they, after 4 years of criminal cases?
So in Parti Liani's case, her case was was basically made a big splash because it was, you know, $50,000 and it was a complete acquittal. She didn't want to work, but if she wanted to, she could have, because she was cleared, right? So all those whose name are completely, they have no warning or no charge, they are allowed to work. They're allowed to seek re-employment. But if you have a stern warning or you have a conviction, no.
Thank you very much. And I think,
you.
as we say, we are, I know you have another important thing. So I think there are, oh, sorry, there is one more question. Iran?
Yes. Hello.
Are you going to ask a question?
Yes. One question, please.
Okay,
I
go
am
ahead.
Intan. You can call me Intan from Bandung. Before you said about you have less political power in this issue, but can you explain to us about how you build the I mean, as an NGO, you have to build power to help them
Yes.
link to the, for example, to the journalists or media mass in
Yes.
maybe in Singapore and in the other country where the workers came. I'm sorry, like Indonesia, because in Indonesia, especially for what we say, digital power, you know, like netizens here very, very always interesting with issue like this. If you can push this issue in what we say in digital network, I think people in Indonesia, for example, like in my country, can push their own country, their own government to speak about this issue. How about that? I mean, can you tell?
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
No, that's a good question. And actually, when the Partiliani case happened, it got a lot of attention in Indonesia as well. And I think for some time, there was a lot of spotlight on, you know, the plights of Indonesian migrant domestic workers who come to Singapore to, you know, what really are their living and working conditions and all of that. But of course, you know, it's how sustained all of that can be. I mean, on our part, we do. I mean, we are big fans of giving media attention to cases. You know, one of our biggest advocacy tools is storytelling about specific cases, because I think that spotlights, you know, issues about domestic workers and migrant workers in general very well. We partner with a lot of regional NGOs and, of course, NGOs who are based in the in the sending countries, so that, you know, when we say something, they can amplify it and kind of sort of push the needle a little bit on some of these issues. The pace of change, to be very honest, is very slow. I think, you know, all of us in the CSO and NGO sectors, we are aware of that, because, you know, migrant workers, they are often not regarded as, you know, their well-being issues are not regarded as important or as lucrative. But definitely, I think, you know, cross-border collaboration and kind of helping amplify each other's issues is very, very key. And also what it does, it's sort of, and with, especially with social media, right? Because what I have seen and what we have seen is that when an issue triggers the local population, when an issue about migrant workers triggers the local population, then the change happens much more quicker. So if there's outrage about, so because there was so much outrage about Partiliani's case, then I think we saw some changes, which is that, you know, some of them being allowed to work, of course, not as much as we wanted to, but some small change that happened because, you know, even the local populations and, you know, the other ones with political power, they were able to say, hey, why is this happening to our migrant workers? You know, it shouldn't be this way. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. And so we close again this episode of Wednesday seminar, which focus on migration issue in Southeast Asia, an initiative of the Institute for Population and Social Research of Mahidol University and Junction Cultural Center in Bangkok. Thank you very much for and Anil for being willing to partner with us. We hope we can call you on you again because, of course, Singapore is very important for migration from Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and many other locations in Southeast Asia. So it's very central to the migration circuit, so to say. For those who follow Junction, we will have on the 2nd of December an event on TIC, a book launch, and later the beginning of 5 of December, we will have a quite interesting exhibition of 75 years of human rights history in the Philippines as seen by Filipino painters. So please do follow us and later on come to visit the exhibition. Thank you again and see you to our next event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye and good luck to your new presentation.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.